concealed anything right now.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead and place your hands behind your back, please.
Why?
All right, you're being detained.
Okay. Let me put my cigarette in the back of my case.
You got that.
What am I being detained for now?
Just hang tight.
Oh my God, are you kidding me? Why are you doing this? I seriously like to know because
I will. Just let
The stop begins the way so many do: ordinary, procedural, and deceptively calm. A deputy introduces himself, explains the reason for contact, and frames the encounter around a suspended license. From the first exchange, there is already a quiet tension forming, not because of aggression, but because of contradiction. The driver insists the suspension does not exist. She produces identification. She complies. Her tone is confused rather than confrontational, defensive rather than defiant. This distinction matters because early officer perceptions often determine how wide the encounter will expand. At this stage, the power balance is still relatively even. The deputy controls the stop, but the driver retains narrative footing. She explains why she pulled into the driveway. She contextualizes her behavior. She offers personal background, not as an excuse, but as an explanation. These early moments are filled with what policing doctrine often calls voluntary cooperation, yet they also contain the first institutional blind spot. Once a system flags a license as suspended, the human explanation becomes secondary. From that point forward, the stop is no longer about whether the suspension makes sense. It is about how it will be enforced. When the deputy begins examining insurance documents, the encounter subtly shifts from clarification to investigation. The driver produces multiple cards, some outdated, some current, attempting to reconcile a bureaucratic discrepancy in real time. She does not refuse. She does not obstruct. She searches openly, narrating her actions, apologizing for clutter. These behaviors typically signal compliance and low threat, but they also introduce a paradox. The more she talks, the more fragmented her explanation becomes, not because it is untrue, but because she is trying to reconcile confusion under pressure. This is where escalation psychology quietly takes hold. The deputy explains Florida's administrative suspension process, framing it as an automatic mechanism triggered by insurance status. Whether accurate or not, the explanation functions as closure from the officer's perspective. The conclusion has already been reached. What follows is logistics. The vehicle cannot be driven. The tag must be seized. A tow becomes inevitable. At no point is the driver accused of a crime. Yet the consequences already feel punitive. The driver's emotional state begins to shift her not into hostility, but into vulnerability. She expresses financial hardship. She pleads not to have the vehicle towed. She proposes alternatives that would maintain compliance while minimizing harm. None of these suggestions alter the outcome. This is not because the deputy is necessarily malicious, but because discretion is narrowing. Administrative enforcement leaves little room for nuance, and once that path is chosen, every subsequent decision aligns toward control rather than resolution. When a second deputy arrives, the encounter's tone changes again. The presence of backup is common and often justified, but it also signals a shift in posture. What was a traffic stop becomes a managed scene. The driver is asked to step out. Her belongings are placed on the hood. Her movements are controlled. These steps are framed as safety measures, yet the threat level has not materially changed. There is no report of weapons, no visible aggression, no attempt to flee. The justification rests entirely on procedural habit rather than situational necessity. As the driver stands outside the vehicle, she continues explaining about moving, about searching for her cat, about exhaustion. These details are not irrelevant. They contextualize her stress, her disorganization, her emotional volatility. But institutional interactions rarely accommodate context. Instead, they often interpret emotional expression as instability. Instability, in turn, is treated as a precursor to unpredictability, and unpredictability justifies restraint. The decision to tow the vehicle becomes the fulcrum around which everything else pivots. The driver's focus narrows. Her anxiety escalates. She tries to contact someone for assistance. She asks questions not to challenge authority, but to understand what is happening to her life in that moment. Each unanswered question compounds her distress. The longer the stop continues, the more she loses control over both her property and her autonomy. Up to this point, the interaction remains legally administrative. No arrest has been announced. No crime articulated. Yet the machinery of enforcement keeps moving forward. The deputies begin inventorying the vehicle, documenting items, preparing for impound logistics. Inventory searches are often justified as protective measures, but they also create opportunities for criminal exposure. Once the vehicle is subject to tow, its contents are no longer private in practice, regardless of the driver's understanding of her rights. Then comes the moment that redefines the encounter entirely. Without a clear explanation tied to a new offense, the driver is suddenly placed in handcuffs. This is the moment selected as the opening hook because it represents the sharpest authority shift in the entire video. 1 second, she is a distressed motorist navigating bureaucratic confusion. The next, she is physically restrained. The justification offered is vague, framed as precaution rather than cause. This ambiguity is critical. Handcuffing is not neutral. It is a use of force, even when described as temporary or procedural. From a legal standpoint, handcuffing typically requires articulable reasons related to officer safety, flight risk, or criminal suspicion. Yet none of those factors have been clearly established. The driver has remained compliant. She has not attempted to leave. She has not threatened anyone. The restraint appears to arise not from behavior, but from momentum. The stop has grown complex, emotional, and inconvenient. Handcuffs simplify complexity by asserting absolute control. The reading of Miranda rights immediately after compounds the gravity of the moment. Miranda is not a courtesy, it is a constitutional trigger tied to custodial interrogation. By reading these rights, the deputies implicitly acknowledge that the driver is no longer free to leave. The interaction has crossed the threshold from detention into custody, whether formally acknowledged or not. This transition happens abruptly, without a clear narrative bridge for the person experiencing it. The driver's reaction is not violent. It is disbelief, confusion, emotional overload. She asks why this is happening. She expresses physical discomfort, referencing prior injuries. These are not tactics. They are human responses to sudden loss of agency. The deputies respond with procedural language: policy, safety, protocol. Policy becomes the shield that prevents discretion from re-entering the equation. Soon after, the encounter takes its most consequential turn. Alleged contraband is located. The discovery is framed as definitive, yet the context surrounding it is murky. The driver immediately denies ownership. She offers alternative explanations: recent movers, borrowed items, shared spaces. These explanations are dismissed not because they are disproven, but because they are inconvenient. Once contraband is associated with a person's property, the presumption of innocence erodes rapidly in practice, even if it remains intact in theory. The language used by the deputies shifts again, this time toward experiential authority. One deputy references prior encounters with addicts, framing his assessment through pattern recognition rather than evidence. This rhetorical move is powerful. It reframes the situation from what is proven to what feels familiar. Familiarity becomes credibility. The driver's protests become noise. What makes this escalation particularly troubling is how far removed it is from the original justification for the stop. A suspected administrative suspension has now led to a custodial arrest on drug-related allegations, despite no initial indicators of impairment, distribution, or criminal intent. Each step along the way is legally defensible in isolation, yet the cumulative effect feels disproportionate. This is how systems produce outcomes that no single decision-maker fully owns. Throughout this phase, the driver's vulnerability increases while her credibility decreases. Emotional distress is interpreted as guilt. Confusion is interpreted as inconsistency. Her attempts to explain are framed as contradictions. The narrative hardens against her, even as she continues to comply physically. The handcuffs ensure compliance, but they also ensure silence, or at least the irrelevance of her voice. By the end of this first part, the transformation is complete. The driver is no longer a citizen navigating an administrative error. She is an arrestee. Her property is catalogued. Her freedom is removed. Her explanations are discounted. The authority dynamic has fully inverted, and all of it traces back to a series of small, compounding decisions, non-explosive on their own, but devastating in aggregate. This is not a story about a single bad moment. It is a story about how ordinary procedures, when applied without proportional restraint, can quietly escalate into life-altering consequences. In the next part, the focus will shift to the evidentiary claims, the contradictions in reasoning, and the institutional habits that allow uncertainty to masquerade as certainty long after the handcuffs click shut. By the time the cuffs are secured, the encounter has already passed the point of no return. What follows is not about whether escalation should have happened, but how it is justified after the fact. This distinction is critical because once authority is exercised at its highest level, everything that comes next is framed to support that decision. The system does not ask whether restraint was necessary, it asks how to rationalize it. The discovery of alleged contraband becomes the linchpin. Yet the way that discovery unfolds raises fundamental questions about evidentiary logic, narrative framing, and confirmation bias. The items are not found during a traffic stop for drug-related behavior. They are not discovered after probable cause tied to narcotics. They appear only after the vehicle is subject to tow, after the driver is already emotionally overwhelmed, and after her belongings have been handled, moved, and inventoried under institutional authority. From a legal perspective, possession is rarely as simple as proximity. Constructive possession requires knowledge and control. Yet in practice, proximity often substitutes for proof. When deputies state that items came from her purse or her vehicle, the conclusion becomes foregone. Ownership is presumed. Intent is implied. Alternative explanations are treated as deflection. The driver's immediate response is consistent and emphatic. The items are not hers. She offers context: recent movers, borrowed space, shared access. In any other investigative context, these claims would trigger follow-up questions. Who had access? When? Under what circumstances? Instead, the response she receives is experiential dismissal. One deputy explains that in his experience, addicts do not leave supplies behind. This statement is not evidence. It is anecdote elevated to authority. This is where the psychology of policing intersects with systemic bias. Pattern recognition is a necessary skill in law enforcement, but it is also a dangerous one when it replaces verification. The deputy is not lying when he describes his experience. But experience is not proof, and familiarity is not fact. When personal heuristics override objective inquiry, the investigation becomes circular. The presence of contraband proves guilt, and guilt explains the presence of contraband. As the deputy sort through belongings, the power imbalance becomes absolute. The driver is restrained, unable to intervene, unable to point, unable to demonstrate context. Her words are the only tool she has left, and words carry little weight against physical evidence once it has been framed as incriminating. Every denial becomes suspect. Every emotional reaction becomes confirmation. The deputies begin highlighting inconsistencies in her statements, not inconsistencies about facts, but about interpretations. Where items were located. Which bag belonged to whom. What she thought had been said moments earlier. These discrepancies are natural under stress, yet they are treated as deception rather than confusion. Stress fractures memory, especially when autonomy is removed. But the system rarely accounts for that. At this stage, the interaction is no longer investigative, it is prosecutorial in tone. The deputies are not asking whether she knew about the items. They are explaining why they believe she must have known. This rhetorical shift is subtle but decisive. Once belief replaces inquiry, the outcome is predetermined. The driver's vulnerability deepens when deeply personal property is handled. Items of emotional significance are treated as potential hiding places. Requests for care are acknowledged verbally but overridden procedurally. The message is clear. Personal meaning does not outweigh institutional suspicion. Even when deputies attempt to reassure her, the reassurance is conditional, dependent on compliance, silence, and submission. Throughout this process, policy is invoked repeatedly. Policy explains why cuffs remain behind her back. Policy explains why she cannot adjust her position. Policy explains why requests for relief are delayed. Policy functions as both justification and barrier. It absolves individual discretion by deferring responsibility upward to rules written far from the scene and applied without context. Yet policy is never applied neutrally. Officers choose when to invoke it and when to interpret it flexibly. In this case, policy consistently aligns with maximum control. The driver is framed as a potential risk, despite no evidence of violence or resistance. Her physical discomfort is acknowledged but not alleviated. Her emotional distress is recognized but not accommodated. The narrative presented to her also evolves. Initially, she is told this is precautionary. Then it becomes investigatory. Then it becomes accusatory. By the time formal arrest language is used, the shift feels abrupt to her but logical to the deputies. This gap in perception is one of the most damaging aspects of authority-driven encounters. What feels inevitable from inside the system feels arbitrary from the outside. As the deputies explain the arrest, they rely heavily on the concept of responsibility rather than intent. The items were in her space. The vehicle is registered to her. The purse is identified as hers. Responsibility becomes strict liability, untethered from knowledge or consent. This framework is efficient for enforcement, but devastating for individuals who share space, resources, or circumstances with others. The driver repeatedly offers to submit to testing, to prove sobriety, to demonstrate lack of drug use. These offers are irrelevant at this point. The arrest is not about impairment, it is about possession. This distinction is never fully clarified for her, leaving her trapped in a logic she cannot penetrate. She argues innocence in a framework that no longer considers innocence a relevant variable. As the scene progresses, deputies begin documenting property meticulously. High-value items are listed. Electronics are catalogued. This process is framed as accountability, but it also reinforces the finality of the situation. Documentation signals permanence. It tells the arrestee that the system has moved on from questioning to processing. The driver's requests become smaller. She asks for water. She asks for comfort. She asks for understanding. Each request is met with procedural limits. The humanity of the moment is acknowledged verbally but constrained operationally. This is a common feature of institutional interactions, empathy without accommodation. One of the most revealing moments occurs when the deputy compares her situation to a recent arrest involving significant quantities of drugs. The comparison is intended to contextualize suspicion, but it has the opposite effect. It demonstrates how individual cases are filtered through recent experiences, not evaluated independently. Her situation is not assessed on its own merits, it is measured against a mental archive of prior arrests. This is how bias compounds. Not through overt prejudice, but through cognitive shortcuts reinforced by repetition. Each arrest becomes a template for the next. Each denial sounds like the last denial. Each explanation resembles the previous explanation. Over time, the system becomes deaf to nuance. As the driver is prepared for transport, the language used around her shifts again, this time toward containment and efficiency. The priority becomes moving her, securing the scene, completing paperwork. Her narrative is no longer relevant except insofar as it might complicate processing. She is told where she will go, what will happen next, what she cannot do. Choice has evaporated. Yet even now, she continues to explain, not because it will change the outcome, but because being heard feels like the last remaining form of agency. Her explanations are not attempts to evade responsibility, they are attempts to reclaim identity. She is trying to be seen as more than the charges being assembled around her. By the end of this phase, the encounter has crystallized into a familiar institutional story. Contraband found, suspect denies ownership, arrest made. The complexity of how the situation arrived there is flattened into a linear narrative suitable for reports and courtrooms. The administrative stop, the emotional vulnerability, the procedural escalations, all of it fades behind the simplicity of possession. But simplicity is deceptive. This case is not about drugs appearing in a vacuum. It is about how systems handle uncertainty. When uncertainty arises, authority tends to resolve it in favor of control. When control is asserted, justification follows. And once justification is established, reversal becomes nearly impossible. In the final part, the focus will turn to the broader implications of this encounter, how institutional momentum overrides proportionality, how administrative enforcement bleeds into criminalization, and how individuals caught in moments of instability become easy vessels for systemic power long before any court ever weighs the evidence. By the final stage of the encounter, the machinery of enforcement is no longer reactive, it is routine. What began as an administrative traffic stop has now been fully absorbed into the criminal justice pipeline, where efficiency, containment, and documentation outweigh deliberation. The system is no longer asking what happened. It is recording what will be said to have happened. The driver's physical and emotional condition deteriorates as the process continues. She reports numbness, pain, prior injuries, and mounting distress. These are acknowledged but subordinated to protocol. Requests for water, repositioning, or relief are treated as logistical complications rather than medical concerns. The deputies offer EMs repeatedly, not as a solution, but as a procedural safeguard. When she declines, the system moves on. Her discomfort remains unresolved, but liability has been addressed. This dynamic reveals a central truth about institutional encounters. Care is often framed in terms of risk management rather than well-being. As long as the correct boxes are checked, the outcome is considered acceptable. Pain that does not rise to the level of emergency is tolerated. Distress that does not threaten control is managed through instruction rather than assistance. The conversation increasingly centers on logistics, transport, towing, property disposition, jail intake. Each logistical decision reinforces the finality of the arrest. The driver's concerns about her vehicle, her belongings, her finances, and her pets are met with explanations of procedure. These explanations are not unkind, but they are inflexible. Compassion exists only within the narrow corridors allowed by policy. One of the most revealing moments occurs as deputies inventory the vehicle and list its contents aloud. This act is framed as accountability, yet it also serves another purpose. It asserts ownership over the narrative. By naming and categorizing her property, the system symbolically claims control over her world. What was once personal becomes administrative. The driver repeatedly expresses fear not of the deputies, but of what this arrest means for her life. Housing instability, financial precarity, emotional attachment to her pets, and recent upheaval all surface. These disclosures are not strategic. They are confessions of vulnerability. In another context, they might trigger social support. Here, they are background noise. This is how criminalization often operates, not through overt hostility, but through indifference to context. The system does not deny her hardship, it simply deems it irrelevant. Enforcement proceeds because enforcement is what the system is designed to do. As transport approaches, the tone of the interaction becomes transactional. Deputies explain what will happen at the jail, how phone calls work, how property will be handled. These explanations are delivered calmly, almost kindly. Yet they underscore the asymmetry of power. The driver listens because she must. Her future is now scheduled by others. The issue of cash becomes a final flashpoint. Money, already scarce, represents survival. The driver's desperation is palpable as she pleads not to lose it. The deputies, bound by policy, refuse to leave it unsecured. Again, the refusal is not personal. But to the person experiencing it, the effect is devastating. Each procedural necessity feels like another loss. Throughout this phase, the deputies maintain composure. They do not raise their voices. They do not mock or insult her. This makes the encounter more troubling, not less. The absence of overt abuse highlights how harm can occur even when everyone follows the rules. The system does not require cruelty to produce suffering. It requires only rigidity. The driver continues to assert innocence, not because she believes it will change the outcome, but because silence feels like surrender. Her statements are no longer addressed substantively. They are acknowledged and set aside. The narrative has already been written. Anything that does not fit it is excluded. This moment illustrates the difference between justice and process. Justice requires inquiry, skepticism, and proportionality. Process requires completion. Once the process is in motion, its priority is resolution, not truth. The truth will be sorted later, in court, through mechanisms that are inaccessible, expensive, and slow. For now, the system only needs enough certainty to move forward. The deputies' repeated references to policy serve another function. They diffuse responsibility. Each decision is framed as mandatory rather than chosen. This framing protects individuals from blame but also obscures accountability. When harm results, it is unclear who, if anyone, is responsible. The rulebook becomes both shield and sword. As the encounter concludes, the driver is no longer addressed as a person with a story. She is an arrestee with charges, property, and a destination. Her earlier explanations about her cat, her move, her insurance feel distant, almost surreal. The transformation is complete. Identity has been replaced by classification. What makes this case particularly instructive is not the presence of a single egregious act, but the accumulation of small, defensible decisions. Each step follows from the last. Each choice narrows the next. By the time the outcome appears extreme, it feels inevitable. This is how systems normalize escalation. Administrative enforcement becomes criminal exposure. Procedural caution becomes physical restraint. Inventory becomes evidence. Experience becomes assumption. Policy becomes absolution. None of these transitions are dramatic on their own. Together, they are life-altering. This encounter also exposes a fundamental imbalance in how uncertainty is resolved. When the system is uncertain, it defaults to control. When the individual is uncertain, it is interpreted as deception. The burden of clarity rests entirely on the person with the least power to provide it. The broader implication is sobering. Many people live in states of instability: financial, emotional, social. They share vehicles. They borrow space. They rely on others. In such conditions, strict liability frameworks are especially dangerous. They criminalize association and proximity. They turn survival strategies into legal risks. The driver's story does not end at the roadside. It continues through booking, charging decisions, court appearances, and consequences that ripple outward: employment, housing, custody, reputation. None of those outcomes are visible in the bodycam footage, yet they are set in motion here. Body cameras are often presented as tools of transparency. They are. But transparency alone does not guarantee accountability. What they reveal must still be interpreted within a framework that values proportionality, context, and restraint. Without that framework, footage becomes just another record of power exercised efficiently. This case challenges the viewer to look beyond individual actors and examine the architecture of enforcement itself. It asks how many similar encounters unfold quietly, without headlines or outrage, guided by rules that prioritize order over understanding. It asks what happens when systems designed for worst-case scenarios are applied to everyday human confusion. In the end, the most unsettling aspect is not that something went wrong, but that everything went according to plan. The deputies followed policy. The procedures were observed. The documentation was completed. And yet, the outcome feels profoundly misaligned with the circumstances that began the encounter. That is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this footage. Harm does not always require malice. Sometimes, it requires only a system that cannot slow down long enough to see the person standing in front of it.